Hey everyone, thank you all for being here. This person right here is Andy Glenn. Andy Glenn is with us in this room today. And Andy is a furniture maker and woodworking instructor and 2008 graduate of our cabinet and furniture making program. While living in Kentucky as head of the Woodcraft Department of Berea College, Andy was taken by the prevalence of handmade ladderback chairs and began driving through the eastern Kentucky foothills seeking out these chairs and their makers. The simple question, are there backwoods chairmakers working today, was the first spark that led to this book, Backwoods Chairmakers, in Search of the Appalachian Ladderback Chairmaker. His book explores the tradition of this regional craft and takes you inside the shops of more than 20 makers with photos and personal interviews about their lives and techniques. There are also instructions in the back on how to make a post and rung side chair and rocking chair using the traditional techniques explored in the book. Andy's going to talk us through this book and his research and process and journey. And at the end of that, you can buy a book here and talk to Andy further, get him to sign it. So we'll have time for that at the end. We'll also have time at the end for plenty of questions from all of you, which I'll kick off towards the end. Welcome, Andy, and thank you for being here with us in person today.
Thank you, Kristen. Thanks, Kevin, for having me in. Our family actually, we used to live in the old building, and Ruby was born. Ruby's with us today. She'll stare at me when I talk too long about chairs. Ruby was born at MGH, and then we lived over on North Bennet Street. And Ruby's room was this small closet over there for a few years until we headed up towards Maine. And I was the caretaker at the time, and Claire and Lillian would hold Ruby as an infant. So it's kind of nice that Ruby's back today. We moved to Kentucky in 2017. We took a job as the head of Woodcraft at Berea College. And everywhere you looked, there were these chairs, ladderback chairs. Most of them handmade. They'd be at the pizza shop, they'd be at junk shops, in the local museums. After a while I started noticing them. They'd be at garage sales, somebody would spray paint this pink, you just find it everywhere. But a lot of them were handmade. I mean, this chair is easily mass produced, but there were plenty that were still handmade, and just the process of getting the bark is extremely hard. So, being an outsider, being new to the area, I wondered if there were still makers working, doing this, and specifically, offline. Not much of the community that I engage with is on, through social media. See what's happening, but there's plenty of makers out there off of social media. So. Started looking around at first found an old craft catalog and reached out to a gentleman named Terry Ratliff, who'd been doing it years before, and he invited me out just for a couple days just to watch him make chairs, essentially. Kind enough to put me up. This was before the book was even around. But he was still making. He's in the mountains in eastern Kentucky. And then slowly this book started to come into focus, where I would travel around and try to find and meet and interview working chairmakers. The book itself, it's focused on the people, the place, the chairs, and the techniques. So it always goes back towards the chairs, no matter how far afield, the stories and whatnot go. This is a chair by one of the chairmakers in the book, by Mason Alexander. This is as straightforward a version of an Appalachian chair as you'll find. This one's not bent in the back, so it's a little easier to make straight posts. The feet taper. There's very little decoration or ornamentation on these chairs, and most often they have a woven seat, which frequently hickory bark. There's, the whole region's covered in hardwood forest, so hickory and hickory bark, it's common. It's just a lot of hard work to go and get it. The way these are a little different than, say, New England. New England ladderbacks tended to have more turning, a little more ornate, with a rush seat. And shaker, a lot of people are familiar with shaker ladderbacks. Beautiful chairs, much like this, straight back. Straight back chairs tend to feel like they're pushing you out of them, so a little more uncomfortable. These, this chair is designed to be, you're supposed to rock back in it to have some comfort. And with a straight back chair, I know we've got a lot of woodworkers in here. One way to get some tilt is to push the leg forward. So push it underneath the seat so you kick the back out. But you really don't want your shoulders much behind the bottom foot, or it becomes quite tippy. So you'll see some shaker chairs that have that back bend or that rake, but it's not very common. I would call the chair makers. There were a few I could find online. They tended to teach at some of the local craft schools. John C. Campbell. Sometimes other chair makers would know of these chair makers. But otherwise, I spoke to a lot of folk museums, spoke to town photographers, folklorists who knew their communities, and they would know of chair makers. Like Mason, this chair here by Mason. Mason lived 15 miles outside of Berea. He'd been building chairs for 50 years. It took me 2 years to find him. It was just by happenstance that found him. Mason doesn't have a phone, doesn't publicize in any way. People essentially through word of mouth find out about him. You've got to travel down his lane to put in an order, and then he'll tell you, next winter, come back and I'll have your chairs. And that's the business, and he's been busy with it, as busy as he wants to be. This chair here, this was one I picked up and bought from him as a memento. This was $200. So his chairs were $200, $300, and a big armed rocker was $500. And I tried to, anytime people would share their prices, if they were comfortable with it, I'd put it in the book. And as we go, if you have questions, shout out. Yeah.
Were any of the makers hesitant to publish it just because they don't want to be overrun, or they like the face of their life?
Not in that way. One of the mistakes I made right up front, I don't know if mistakes, but something I had to learn was we'd talk on the phone, and then I would drive and meet them. We hadn't met face to face before. This book's an abstract concept. Lost Art Press doesn't mean anything to them. And I would arrive, and then I'd immediately start to get my gear out of the vehicle. And I'd think, all right, let's get to work. Let's do it. This will be fun. But what I realized, I was making two mistakes. One, I was showing up empty-handed. I should have had a gift, something sweet, anything to show the appreciation for their hospitality. And then two is that I was an outsider, and you know, Appalachians, this is a broad brush here, but, you know, the region, the people are sometimes, have been exploited over the years. They have been caricatured as in unkind ways in many ways. So, you know, I'm a fast talking, at least on the phone, I'm a fast talking, you know, northerner. You know, what am I going to do with their stories? What am I going to do with their work? The book, they don't know what's going to come of it, you know, when I show up. So I realized I had to show up and then just get out of the vehicle and we could talk for a while, you know, just sit and talk. And then usually they would say, well, we better get to it if we're going to do it. And they would tell me when it was time to get to work. And then I usually would write it up. I'd write it and then I'd get it back to them to make sure just to make sure I got things right. And a few times the chairmaker would say, like, well, I did share that, but I really don't want that story out there. So, you know, we just edit it out. One thing that was pretty cool were the stories and the photos of, like, the chairmaking as a craft, and I very much enjoyed talking as a craft, but it really was all-encompassing. It was, you know, the whole family could be involved in it in many ways. It was some people described it as a lifestyle, chairmaking, but children grew up in the shop. You know, one chairmaker discussed how they put the pack and play off to the edge while they're turning and working, and the child grew up there. You know, so there's a lot of cool stories like that. This is where I focused. You can all those dots are the chairmakers. Most of them I visited. The white section is the border of Appalachia, as kind of categorized by the Appalachian Regional Commission. Appalachia is interesting in that, like, yes, there's this defined border of it, I suppose, but that's more for political purposes, as far as different programs and whatnot. You know, I would ask chairmakers, you know, is this an Appalachian chair? And they would look at me like I would never use the word Appalachia. You know what I mean? I'm a Kentuckian, I'm a Tennessean. I think outside the region maybe that term's used a little bit more. But I tried to stick to Central Appalachia, Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia, Kentucky. And then if the chairs and the stories took me elsewhere, I'd follow them out. Again, and just I'll go through some images of chairs. You'll see a variation of these chairs, but a lot of them have the same characteristics. Few details, little ornamentation, tapered feet. A lot of them have a back bend, and you know, the front of the upper post is cut away just for comfort and lightness. This is Randy Ogle, who's down in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. He can weave in a corn shucks seat, but he says nobody wants to pay for it, so now he weaves in seagrass, but he'll do that same pattern.
Can I say something about that?
Yeah.
Do the chairmakers have certain patterns that they stick to represent themselves, or is it just like a broader pattern? Like, do they have signature patterns?
They do. Like, Randy's the third generation in his shop, and so he's using patterns that his grandfather created in the 1950s, and those details from his shop are different than someone down the street, so you could tell the chairs apart.
So you'd be able to almost identify a chairmaker by the pattern,
Yes.
possibly?
Yes. And now there aren't as many, so you just know who's the chairmaker in town. But you could tell by the pattern. I think Randy's signature is that woven seat pattern. And this is an older version, but he makes a newer version of this chair. I want to say out of walnut for maybe $320, something along those lines. That's James Cooper. He is a chairmaker. He was a chairmaker. Was a chairmaker for 15 years. Gave it up as it's bad business. It's crummy. For all sorts of different reasons. But the main one being it's just so hard. It's just so hard to make a living. So hard to to do it as James called it, as bread and butter. But he made these wonderful rockers, and this is his cabin, Rockcastle County, Kentucky. He didn't like his picture taken, so we got his pup. Tom Donahue in North Carolina, and Tom found success showing his chairs at doll shows. Cannon County, Kentucky. That question of signature of a chair. In Cannon County, it's the finial on the top of the turning, the back post. Everybody has a different one, all the different shops, and these chairs are out on all the front porches, so you can tell which shop they came from. That chair this is like production green wood, as stripped to its full production capacity. That chair is sold $65.
Is it supposed to be painted or something?
Yeah, the customer's supposed to paint it, or stain it, or whatnot.
Is that why they're using maple?
Yeah, the posts were usually maple or poplar.
Mm-hmm.
I think those were like the best, cheapest trees in the community. They would mill them out on Friday, cut them all up, and then they'd produce during the week, and they'd go out on a trailer on Friday, and they'd start the process again. And so there were 4 shops in Cannon County. There used to be 30 to 40 shops in Cannon County running like this. The shop just behind the house, couple chairmakers in there, and it was just production work. And they're down to 4, and they still seem to be doing pretty well. But their competition, a couple of them were cursing that Cracker Barrel chair with the crackle finish. Those were pretty fun to visit. So they buy the dowels. Some of them buy the dowels, hickory dowels in bulk. Everything else is cut out, hand turned, and as quick as possible. They usually make 30 to 40 a week, with one to 1.5 people in the shop. Michael Houston, who learned it in Kentucky, and then he went on to a career in Colorado, but he's been making chairs ever since, and he's added wrought iron, and he's gone in all sorts of different directions with his chairs, outside, expanding the tradition a little bit. Anyone know this chairmaker?
Chester.
Yeah. Cornett. Yeah. Chester Cornett. Chester started as like a traditional chairmaker in eastern Kentucky, and made just beautiful side chairs and rockers. But you could almost say he was like born in the wrong era, because he would build them. This was in the 50s and 60s, 1950s, 60s. He would carry them to town, a number of miles away, 5 miles away from where he was, to Hazard, Kentucky, and he would set up on the roadside and sell until they were sold, then head home. But I met people who had said, like, they would see him on Sunday evening still having not sold his chairs, and he might sell them for 50 cents, maybe $1, just to get some money and get back home. So he started making more elaborate chairs that kind of grabbed your attention. Just incredible skill. I love them. I wouldn't be surprised if some of you were repulsed by it, because it's something. It's also very uncomfortable. You either have to like straddle or cross your legs and swing them to the side, because otherwise those center rockers are going to clip you, and it's quite deep.
Is there a purpose behind the center rockers, that he added them? Or
Yeah.
is it just,
No, I don't think there's any other purpose. Yes?
Was the intent like artistry, or was it like marketing to grab attention?
No, I think it was artistry. I don't know how I can't remember how the double rocker came about. He made a number of these, and they sold well, and they sold for a lot more than his standard rocker. And they started where like the seat was a true octagon, and then he started to flatten the front of the seat, and he tried to make them a little more comfortable. But my guess is, like many of his chair designs, like it came to him in a dream, and then he had to make it. This one I believe is in the Kentucky Folk Art Museum in Eastern Kentucky. It's beautiful. That's all draw knife work. He'd carve all the pegs in pins. I mean, it's just really a gorgeous chair. That one's also one of his. It's one of the last ones he made. That one was towards the end of his life, when he was living in Cincinnati. And I think a couple of his friends or customers, they went to the zoo, and he saw the diamondback rattlesnakes. He had a dream that night, and then he had to make this chair. And I think he said, when they interviewed him, he said he's never going to sell it. And he said that about all his chairs, but he ended up selling all of them for a little money. His work, his work, you can just, there's some, well, obviously no one's making a rattlesnake rocker, but you can tell his work from anywhere.
Did he get a fairly large cult following in his lifetime, or is it mostly since?
It's mostly since.
Yeah.
He, when he moved up to the Cincinnati area, some people noticed his artistry and appreciated it. And one couple in particular worked at Procter & Gamble, and they could work as a kind of a liaison to help Chester with communication and work with clients. And so, the last 10 years of his life were probably the most stable and steadiest as far as work.
But this stuff was never sold out of the account or anything, it was just out of the shop. Yeah.
Right. Out of his shop. People would come and put in an order. And he'd make one rocker a month, something like that.
Okay.
Mark Newberry, it's 3 generations of chairs, and the shop's right beside him. He's the 3rd generation Newberry and Sons chairmaker. And if any of you have ordered hickory bark or tried to order hickory bark, most of the phone calls go to their home. They're harvesting hickory bark year round. It's what kept their shop afloat in the 90s and early 2000s when all the orders dried up. And that's his father, Louis. That's the same maker as made this chair here. Alexander, it's his grandson Dylan. They work and make chairs together, work together. And then Orphalie and Mason, they usually weave in the seats in their home, and they work together just to to do it in a little bit more comfort. Dick Pointer, I believe this one's in the Yale collection. Enslaved chairmaker in Tennessee, achieved freedom sometime in around 1850, 1849, and became a prolific chairmaker. He had a mule-powered lathe, and his chairs usually have the 3 slats. A lot of times they're maple, and sometimes they have this beautiful pinstriping paint and an oak splint seat, a real delicate oak splint seat. So these chairs are quite prevalent down around Williamson County, Tennessee. This chair is by Patton, and that's his grandson, Mr. Neal. Patton was one of Pointer's contemporaries. And so there were 6 shops, at least I think it was on the 1860 census, of chair-making shops of freed black chairmakers down in central Tennessee. Tom Lynch, he did all his was turning, a lot of them out of cherry, and then he would weave in a hickory bark seat. He called his business Lucky Acorn, chair making, and the top finials all acorns. This is in Rock Cave, West Virginia.
Green cherry?
They'd go and harvest it, and but then green wood doesn't turn all that well, so we'd usually just let it sit for a year, and then come back and turn it once it was air dried. That's one of Terry's chairs that ended up on the cover of the book, and Terry's signature was, these chairs, the grain runs the full length of the piece from end to end, continuously. That's how you can have thin parts without as much fear of them breaking. So they're split out of a log and shaved thin, but you've got the grain running for strength. Terry was one of the few chairmakers I met who, and it became his signature, he would take grain from around a knot or from a flowing piece of wood, and again, the grain's running end to end there, but it might wind and twist, and he would add those to his chairs. And Terry measures by his hand length, by his finger width, by visually what looks right. And so his chairs have a very handmade feel to them, obviously, where the center slat looks like it's tilted just a little bit. I came to love all of that. Again, his obviously very different than Chester, but like his chairs have a distinct feel that when you see them, you just know they're his.
Why only peg top slat?
For strength, that's all you really need.
Yeah.
That's enough. Yeah.
Sorry, Hugo, what was the question?
Only the top slat is pegged. The top
got
Peg
it.
up here.
Got it.
So some chair makers didn't even peg the top slat. Some chair makers thought all the strength to that chair is in the undercarriage. That joint needs to be perfect. Those joints all need to be perfect. Up top's just going to be. And others took the time to fit the slats well and then pin and peg them.
Yeah.
Or maybe even glue them in.
Sure.
That's Terry's place. He built that log cabin. Everything's hand hewn. That's his front yard. I'm standing pretty close to the shop right there. But every beam in there was cut with his axe. It was incredible to see that space. It's beautiful inside. Lyle Wheeler in Marshall, North Carolina. Again, these, Lyle kind of stripped away any extra ornamentation. He makes a very straightforward chair. Most of them are upright. He'll add a finial to the top now and again. But there's no bend to them because, as Lyle said, to get 2 bends to work to match, you got to bend 5, and that's a lot of work. So, going to keep them, have these upright.
Is that seat something other than hickory bark?
I think that looks to me like Lyle mostly puts in hickory bark, so I
It
would.
just seems blonder than most of the hickory bark I've seen.
Sometimes you'll see a flat reed or a smoked reed seat, but it does look very consistent. But he's usually using hickory bark. Sherman Wooten. I loved Sherman's chairs. I absolutely loved them. Crazy uncomfortable to sit in. But I didn't even care. I just enjoyed sitting in it. So he'd find timber that had a bend in it, split it apart for book match. You know, you can see the front post, the back posts are similar. And he did. It might have been him who even started it. He's around Hyden, Kentucky. He did these double rungs. And I asked all around about these double rungs for the seat because I hadn't noticed it elsewhere. And people said it was for a tighter seat and for more strength, but I don't know. I'm not convinced on that. Maybe it is, but it just seems like a lot of material to remove around those posts and still have it be strong. But those have been plenty strong. That's probably 40, 50 years old. And that's hickory bark. It's just been sitting on a porch and it's bleached out. So that's cherry and hickory bark. That's Sherman. I just like this picture because the faces are so like absurd. Obviously staged, but it's pretty great. Anyone know that one?
Yeah, Brian Boggs.
Brian Boggs, yeah. So Brian doesn't make this chair anymore, but he's a contemporary furniture maker in Asheville, North Carolina. And Brian used to travel and teach this, and he taught it here at Bennet Street a number of times. He took the form, the traditional ladderback, reimagined it with contemporary lines, and kind of reintroduced it to a whole new group of people who didn't want just traditional chairs in their home, but loved the Appalachian Ladderback form. I think that one, I can't tell if that's hickory or cherry, but a lot of his are out of cherry. And Brian added this frame to the seat. You can see it's different than some of the chairs up here, or any of the other chairs that just have the post that comes straight up out the top. Brian didn't like that might rest on the underside of your thigh. So he created this frame which is more comfortable. And just every detail on that chair is well considered. It's just a gorgeous chair. Brian's an artist, and maybe 10 years ago, he had made enough of these chairs. You know, he'd made them for 25 years, and he wanted to make other things, explore other forms. And so he kind of released this into the chair community. And so there are a number of chair makers who make it, some who teach classes on it. It's still an extremely popular chair, but Brian's making more of his contemporary designs at this point.
Is he working with greenwood, or is he using greenwood techniques with contract wood? What does?
Brian is
When he was doing this.
well, he's as meticulous a craftsperson as I've ever met.
Yeah.
So in his shop, he has a room or a space dedicated as a dedicated kiln space where he can control the moisture. So on this chair, he got it down. He thought, the no glue chair, which is kind of what Mason has here. He didn't go that route.
Yeah.
Or at least he started by making Jenny Alexander chairs, and then he got into his own designs. But he wanted the best glue joint as possible.
Yeah.
And so he'd make the posts, the uprights, at 8% moisture. He'd dry the rungs to 4%,
Yeah.
and he would get some greenwood action, but also have the best glue joint.
Yeah.
And he was really looking for the best glue
Sure.
joint.
Did you just keep them over a heat lamp or something then to get them that dry? Do you know?
I don't know. I just remember this room with fans and heaters in there and moisture meters. So
Okay.
yeah, when I toured the space. This is traditionally how you get hickory bark. You find a smallish hickory tree. You cut away the outer bark, all the roughness, and inside you're left with this leathery, material that will work right off the tree. You can weave it in, or you can dry it in coils and then just wet it when it's time to use it. And it dries, it's flexible and supple, but then it dries hard.
So you have to keep it wet until you use it.
Yeah, when we're putting it in a seat, we'll get it wet and limber like this, and then we'll have a spray bottle of water as we work just to keep it saturated.
It looks thick. I would tell you if it's about 1/8 of an inch thick.
That one's too thick. That one's off of a larger tree. Larger diameter trees, you might have 1/2 inch of bark on there, 3/8 of an inch of bark. We can thin it by peeling it, like splitting it in two. It'll evenly split, or we can put it in a shave horse and shave it down. But that's a little bit heavy. Even though when we add water, it'll kind of swells. So that's bigger than it'll end up.
But that's too thick to maneuver with for seating,
Yeah.
right?
So that would be a little too thick for seating. What happens when it's that thick is when you go around a tight bend, especially those mineral striations on it, the dark marks, the dark stripes, they tend to crack and split across. It doesn't really weaken it, as long as that crack's not going all the way through. It just doesn't look great. So usually we thin it out before using it. I think ideally we'd find trees that were 5 or 6 inches in diameter, and the bark off of those trees would go right into the chair without any extra work. But it's not always possible. So sometimes you can get 2 coils of bark off of a bigger tree as well as you thin it out.
Now, when they're harvesting, do they just take a strip out of it and leave the rest of the bark alone? Because you take all the bark out, the tree will die, right?
Oh, you're cutting the trees down.
Okay.
Yeah. And so that's a lot. The timber is not great for any part of this tree at that stage if it's a small diameter. If it's a bigger diameter tree, you can probably get parts out of there because you'll get good sections of it with clear grain. But with something small, that's Terry Ratliff working outside his shop, and he's pulling off hickory bark right now. Something that small, the pith tends to wander, and then you're not using the sapwood. That only leaves a small amount of heartwood that might be suitable for chair parts. So that might become a maul or whatever else is necessary, but you cut it down and then you lose the tree.
Good question.
Oh yeah.
Are people cultivating their own trees, or are they just going off into the woods and creating trees?
They're just going off in the woods and getting it. This is, again, I showed Terry's cabin earlier. this is if I turn around and take a shot out, looking out his porch, out into the Cumberland Plateau. There's just hardwoods everywhere. You know, it's just a hardwood forest with materials throughout. So he may just go into his backyard and get some of these logs. And with Terry, you know, people know he's a chairmaker, and so recently he said there was a cherry tree in a farmer's field, and the farmer was going to cut it down just to get rid of it. I guess cherry trees, when they die, the leaves will gather like arsenic, which is poisonous to the animal. So he didn't want it out in his field, but people will call him to get him timber, and he knows where he knows where everything is. Likewise, the coal's big in that region, so if anyone's cutting on a coal site, they'll give him a call, see if he wants it. How'd I do, Ruby?
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm going to start off with a question that I have, and then I know everybody's had the opportunity to ask throughout, but just let's throw them at Andy. You had shown a chair in here, and maybe I misheard. I don't remember if it was a current chairmaker or something that was from many years ago that's selling for $60.
Yeah.
So that's current.
That's current.
Okay, so here's my question. This is a two-part question. It's about the business of, and how, the students here are navigating, leaving, and making product and selling their goods. Two things. One business practice in this book and in this culture of this region is to come back in 2 years and I'll have it ready for you kind of thing. And that aligned with the $60 price point. How did you feel going into these people's homes and sort of, what it would cost you to make a chair now,
Yeah.
and what these students here really should be charging for their work? I mean, how did you reconcile that?
Good question. Mostly I was impressed by it, that they'd found this business practice that had worked for years and years. And really I had more questions around how can you sell that chair for $60 and your neighbor sells that chair for $60 and it's been generational and you've made a livelihood out of this. So I had questions around how is this sustaining,
Right.
that sort of thing. I knew, I was at first I was really surprised at the prices that I would find. $300, $200, $60. And those are the lowest, probably the lowest price chairs that I came upon. Others charge a good deal more. But I think some of it is, that's what the community could pay for a chair, and so that's what that was the going rate that a chairmaker can charge, and it was, in some cases, it was that simple. Yeah.
I just wonder how that information is delivered to the students sitting in this room who, I could never leave this building and build a chair by hand and sell it for $60.
Well, that one wasn't built by hand, that one had
Right.
production possibility behind it.
That one was right. So that one's $60. No matter how you slice it, $60 is incredible.
Yeah.
But those chairmakers had completely figured out how to optimize every step of that, and there were no extra steps.
Yeah.
They didn't sand any edges.
Right.
If they did sand, it was 80 grit, say on the faces of the slats, and that was to help and that might be cross grain to help the paint stick a little bit better, and they're able to purchase materials, and they have old milling equipment on their property. You could always tell who the chairmaker was because the yard was just debris everywhere. and stacks of firewood throughout. You know, so I think,
And 40 chairs a week, 2 people, I mean, that's $60, that's still $4,000 or $5,000 a month.
yeah,
So
yeah.
it's not.
Right, that, you know, I think as I tried to do some of the math, I mean, it was like 1,500 to 2,000 a week, but then you've got to take expenses off because they're usually buying their timber
Sure,
from
of course,
local.
not scale.
But still, that's, you know, depending on their
$40 a
production.
chair,
Yeah,
I would imagine some of that's attributed to cost of living. They probably don't have internet and cable TV and a bunch of cell phones that they're paying for their wife and their kids.
Yeah, I mean, it's- yes and no. I mean, everybody had a different approach to it. Some of them didn't want any of that, like Mason, without the phone number or way to contact them. But then plenty of the other ones did, and they had those expenses that they had to factor in. And then some, you know, this is another thing that was quite interesting. You know, I went into it thinking like, all right, I'm going to meet all these full-time chair makers. And that was kind of my mindset. I didn't really know it at the moment. But like, it's full-time, part-time, all that doesn't really map, that approach doesn't really fit here. They make chairs. Chairs are part of their lives. Sometimes it's growing season and you're putting in a garden, or it's too hot to be in the shop. So chairs are going to be in the morning or in the shade, or wait till winter, because that's when, you know, it's more comfortable to make them. But, or the Tom Lynch, the fellow in West Virginia, he'd make them in the spring and summer and fall, then it's too cold in the winter, so he's doing other things. And a lot of them, like, I stopped thinking full-time, part-time. Everyone I shared today, chairs are part of their lives and livelihood, and they derive income from it. But it's not quite as clear-cut as like, you know, having business models and whatnot like that.
It seems oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
The underlying current of the book and your research, and ending on this image here, and from Kevin's question, is that this community is very, and just as you said, very much in tune with the earth, their area, their location, everything from, no, this season I'm not making chairs because I have to put a garden in.
Yeah.
Too hot in the shop in the summer. You know, there's plenty of wood. There's no clear cutting, obviously. They're pulling from, so that's kind of the underlying story that I feel.
Yeah, I think the chairs fit their lives the way how they want them to fit. I showed Brian Boggs' chair. Brian is like full throttle. He has his 5-10-year goals. He's an artist. He's making, you know, full production. There's a CNC in the shop. There's, you know, it's a cutting edge operation. And then others, you know, this might help. This might answer some of that question. I found kind of two categories of chair makers. Those who came out of a generational shop, so they were continuing this practice. Most all of them considered something else, but wanted to continue as chair makers, or those who came into chair making, and a lot of times they chose it for some of the reasons I've mentioned here: the independence, the lifestyle, that sort of thing. And so there, you know, I think there probably are definitely some financial trade-offs there, but it was a conscious choice. Yes?
Okay, this one might seem a little silly. If they're making the chairs for their immediate community,
Yep.
who's making the tables? Are they also making the tables?
No, it's a good question.
Just sure.
You know, I think some of them could make the chairs, and maybe they do make make the tables. But because some of them, like Randy, who was in Gatlinburg, you know, he makes a bunch of different furniture and chairs. He advertises his chairs, but he can make anything that anybody comes in and asks. And a handful were like that. But but most of them were mostly just chairs, and they were set up for chairs. Their shops really probably couldn't handle a dining table, you know. So unless it was like a hewn, you know, posted rung table, I'm guessing somebody else is making that.
All right, book two.
Yes.
Are any of these generational makers selling through regional craft centers or going to festivals? Or anything like the Highlands Festival in Abington?
Yes.
Do they get booths and go? Or is that just not part of their model?
A few did. The Newberries would do a few shows. Lyle Wheeler does shows and demonstrations. He would do sheep and wool shows as well. A number of these chairmakers, living chairmakers, are part of the Southern Highland Craft Guild,
Right, yeah.
and they'll put on a show and highlight their work. But then others, no. Plenty others don't leave very often. And in fact, I think that's what drew some of them to it. Like Terry, again, this shop, you know, he went and visited a chairmaker when he was considering this. The person just had a spiral bound notebook on his shop wall. He could show all the orders and all the orders coming out or to come. And he said he never left his property, and that sounded pretty appealing. And that's, I mean, Terry will leave and do some demonstrations, especially in the community. And you know, many of these chairmakers are known within their communities. So when Chester Cornett's chairs, you know, I showed one of the double rockers. There's anyone familiar with Apple Shop in Whitesburg, Kentucky? They have a couple of Cornett pieces. They used to just let anybody sit in them, and like one of the intern's dogs chewed up one of them and whatnot. So, but Terry gets the calls for like taking care of that stuff. But he'll do things locally and regionally. You know, Brian travels. He'll go to Italy. He'll go to the West Coast, Colorado, Aspen. But again, he's a category of one, you know. So.
I guess I have a question about Brian Boggs. This is a Backwoods Chairmaker book.
Yeah.
Is there any particular reason why Brian Boggs falls into that category? Is it more because of his design and less so? Because it seems to me that a lot of the people you have in your book, there is a lifestyle.
Yeah.
And he doesn't seem to fall into that style.
Brian, good question. I think Brian did, and I felt like with Brian needed to be in there to because of all of his contributions to ladderback chairmaking. He started in the early 80s. He started making the Jenny Alexander style chair, and then after a number of years, he started doing his own designs. And for 20, 25 years, he made the Berea chair, the Boggs chair, and it was on the cover of magazines. And before I started this, you know, if I closed my eyes and thought of an Appalachian Ladderback, I would think of Brian Boggs' Berea chair. It became quite iconic. And so my hope was to explain how Brian fit. Some of you probably know Brian, the intensity he brings to all this, and then as an artist, why he moved away from it. Right? Not even moved away from it's not even the right way to put it. Like everything he did, moisture content, how he approached it, like it's still the foundation of what he's doing now. It's just a different form. Yeah. Yes.
I have a couple of questions. One, it sounds like there's not a lot of, besides the chairmakers themselves, are there people who do the harvesting of trees for a living? And so a chairmaker might just go to that person to get the wood they want. They don't have to go out to do their own harvesting.
Most chairmakers got their wood from a forester or a sawyer. And there were a few, like Terry, who have timber on his property. He could go collect what he wanted, but most everyone else is purchasing. And they'll know, they've developed a relationship with either a log yard or a cutter, and that forester will know what type of material to collect for them. And in fact, one of the challenges to chair making today, at least as explained by a number of these chair makers, is that their timber cutter has retired or moved away, so getting quality materials is harder. And I should have started with this. These are the people I could find. There are more people out there, plenty more people. I wish I had found them, but this is the totality of who I could come upon. And then you had a second part to that question? Yeah.
Yes, besides wood, were there also people that made, like varnish from the trees? Is that, you didn't really talk about varnishing the wood, or varnishing the chairs. I said you didn't pick up on it.
Yeah. As far as finishing the chairs, probably the most standard approach was just to get some oil on it. Oil the whole thing, including the seat. The hickory bark takes a nice oil, and it looks great, Mason Alexander wasn't thrilled with the linseed oil, so he uses vegetable oil that you can buy at the over the counter. And as long as you put it on thin, it doesn't spoil. It creates a nice finish. I'm guessing that's finished in vegetable oil.
Yeah.
And then others would put on a couple. They might put on a couple coats of spray can lacquer, if the customer wants it. Or the Newberries will sell you. I think their prices are unfinished, and you pay an extra $50 a chair to have it finished by them. Yes.
Talking about Mason, I noticed that all of his chairs consistently are warming. It's almost like he's really choosing that.
I think it just so happened that they had a nice red oak log that they let sit on the property for about 5 years, and then when they opened it up, it was wormy, and they've been working through it for a while.
So they're just still using that.
Yeah.
I think that's a good place to end. If you want to save your question for when we're selling the books, is that a good place to end?
Sounds great.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks everybody.